All right. Okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and kick off this next talk here. I kind of already gave Josh a bit of a intro in my initial kickoff talk, but and this is going to date us a little bit, but I've known Josh for about 20 years now. Back in college is when we first met. So yeah, it feels kind of like it was just yesterday, but also like an eternity at the same time. um, so, anyways, yeah, Josh, even back then, 20 years ago, well before I got into IT as a profession, um, we actually were in the same dorm room for a year. And I remember even back then, 20 years ago, him doing some hardcore, command line Linux hacking skills. And I remember like being like, man, that guy he's a pretty elite hacksaw, and being very envious of his skills. He actually, and I'm sure I'll talk about this, but works for Security Onion Solutions. And pretty much as we were talking yesterday, if you guys are familiar with Security Onion, he was like actively involved with that from almost day one. I mean, from about as soon as Doug Burks put that out, he was a consumer and a user and a contributor to that awesome open source project. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Mr. Josh.
All right, thanks, Paul. Testing 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? All right. All right. Thanks, Paul, for that wonderful introduction. I will give you a tip later. Really appreciate that. Yeah, so, and thanks, Paul, and the rest of the team here who have put together this conference. I know it's been a very short while this morning, but I've enjoyed meeting a few of y'all already. Yes, I said y'all. I currently live in South Carolina. What can I say? I'm a transplant there, but I do say y'all. I appreciate all the blood, sweat, and tears that went into today, and really look forward to the rest of the content and hanging out with some of you. As Paul mentioned, my name is Josh Brower. I've been in IT for a number of years, information security just under 15 years. And really my focus has been on network and endpoint detection with a side of training, a little bit of everything in there. And I currently work for Security Onion Solutions, which is the company behind Security Onion. Anybody here familiar with Security Onion? Okay, a few. So Security Onion is a free and open platform built on Linux that allows you to really monitor your network, your endpoint, threat hunt, do all sorts of fun stuff. And I actually deployed that in production for many years. And as Paul mentioned, contributed to it and joined the company about 3 years ago. I do training on the platform as well as back-end engineering. Without further ado, as Paul would say, let's get started on this very creatively named presentation here, applying Sysmon type prefiltering to Osquery process auditing. Apparently I was not very creative when I put together this presentation. We will get to this in just a second. I want to give you just a little bit of context and kind of lead up to this particular content, okay? We're going to start with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which you're probably familiar with, but if you're not, MITRE ATT&CK framework is a framework that brings together tactics, techniques, and procedures. Do I need to back my mic away a little bit? It's right up here. I speak loud, so I don't know if that was me. The MITRE ATT&CK framework allows you to really look at all the practical tactics, techniques, and procedures that attackers use when attacking your network, right? Thank you very much. And it's been in use the last few years especially, and I want to just real quick look at the website. All right, so this is what we have here. And we have our tactics on the top here, we have our techniques, and if we deploy into, or excuse me, if we dig into one of these, again, I'm not going to go really in depth. We have a summary of it. We have practical examples of this. And if we go all the way down, mitigations, we have our detection. So the framework actually gives us a really good perspective on how to detect this particular issue. we see the data source and the data component, and that's what I want to focus on for each of these different areas in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We have data components that we can draw from to build detections off of. And what's really interesting is that Roberto did some really fascinating work in the last couple of years on taking all of the data sources in the framework and kind of mapping them out and trying to figure out which is the most useful to use for detections. And this is what he came up with. So we have the number of sub-techniques per data source all the way to the far left. We have process monitoring, process command line parameters, and file monitoring are the ones that provide the most coverage. So when you look at all of the different components and tactics and techniques that are used, these three, process command line parameters, process monitoring, and file monitoring, are the data sources that we can primarily use to detect the vast majority of these. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying you should not focus on anything else, because in fact, there's another part to his research that talks about how you can't just use one data source, right? We need at least 2 to 3 typically to verify that there has been a problem or there's been an attack. And so really context is king, and that's kind of a big part of Security Onion, is not just relying on alerts. We surround those alerts with context, with metadata, with endpoint data, different types of data to give you the context you need to verify if there's been an attack. So I go to all of this because I really have employed process auditing in my own production networks for many years, and I really find it to be really promising. Now, can anybody give me any ideas on what are some of the well-known free and open process auditing tools out there? Go ahead and shout it out. Tools that allow you to generate logs about the process creation events on your system. Process is created, this tool generates the data that talks about that. Windows has a built-in one. Yeah, you can do Windows GPOs, you can configure it to log that. Anything else?
Sysinternal tools.
Yes, thank you. Sysmon from Sysinternals. Right, so we actually have quite a few here. So we have the built-in one, like Paul just said. Built in the OS, we have Windows GPO, endpoint security on newer Macs, and Auditing on Linux. Those you can configure to monitor the process creation events on your systems. You have the sysinternal Sysmon, Velociraptor, and Osquery. Velociraptor and Osquery are open source endpoint agents you install on your system, and they provide the process auditing capabilities. Now, these are not all equal. Some of them, have more features than others. We'll see that in just a second. Any ideas, though, kind of think about this. If I deploy something like this in my environment, what is going to be, and I turn this on, I have 100 systems out there, I'm sending all that data back. What's going to be one of the biggest issues I run into if I deploy something like this in my environment? It's going to be one of the biggest issues. Noise and analysis, yes. Yeah, it's going to look something like this, right? Just massive amounts. You're just going to open the floodgates. This is an emergency floodgate for a dam, okay? And it's just like, you're going to turn this on and you're just going to get a massive amount of data, because there are lots of processes being created on a typical system, and not all of them are malicious, right? There's a lot that are well-known, legit, like in Microsoft Windows. There's lots of well-known Microsoft Windows local process creation events. So we have to find a way to really filter out that noise, either include or exclude data from doing that. And that's really the only practical way to deploy process auditing in your environment. I've tried to do it very early on when Sysmon came out. I just deployed it because it looked interesting, and I just got inundated with just massive amounts of data. And again, not only is it, you've got performance issues on your endpoints, you're shipping all that data back from your endpoints to your backend, whether that's Security Onion or your SIM or whatever it may be. And then you have your analyst that has to work through all of that data, right? So there's just a lot of extra work they have to go through with all of that. So that comes to our kind of ties into where we're going here. Because all of these kind of deal with the issue in a different way. Sysmon is a great example. It allows you to define filters that include or exclude certain patterns for process auditing. Has anybody ever used Sysmon either personally or in production or anything like that? With you? Okay. So what it looks like is this. So I download Sysmon, I install it on my Windows computer, and I give it a XML configuration file like this. It's a bit in depth. We're not going to really read it line by line. That would be to like 4 p.m. Really, what I want to show you though is the idea that we have filters defined here. So process creation events right there. All right. So when a process has been created, we're going to exclude it from monitoring if the command line begins with this pattern right here, All right, so this, just this configuration can reduce your logging, on a typical Windows 10 system, a good 20 to 30%. All right, and if you multiply that across all of your systems, that's going to be a major amount of data that you've reduced. Now you can also customize this and reduce it even further. This is actually put out by Swift on Security, a well-known security persona out there, but it is community driven. So there's lots of people that over the years have contributed to these filters. A lot of people who use this filter configuration in production. All right, we'll get back to why that is in just a second and why that's important for us. So now that we've had that context, okay, we've talked about process monitoring or process auditing and why that's important. Talked about some of the tools that are available for that. We talked about how we really want to filter that data though before we bring it into our backend systems. So let's now make the jump and talk about Osquery and how that applies. Has anybody here heard of Osquery before or used Osquery? Few. Okay, Paul, yes, I see that hand. All right. So Osquery is an endpoint agent. It's open source. It was originally open source by Facebook back in 2014 and now lives under the administrative control of the Linux Foundation. It's multi-platform. It's an endpoint agent. You install it on your system. It runs as a service in the background. It has support for Mac, Windows, Linux, the BSDs. And then really one of the key features is that it allows you to use the query language SQL or SQL, depending on how you say that, to query your system as if it's a database. Okay, so you can actually say, I want to see all the users on my Windows 10 system, and instead of having to log into Windows and like pulling up the Windows Management Console or whatever and looking in the control panel, you can use a SQL query using Osquery and find out what users are on the system. Rather than me just talking about it, let me show you real quick. So we're going to the live demos, which are always fun. So here's what we have. We have Osquery installed on a Windows 10 endpoint that's a VM on my system. I'm logged into a web application called FleetDM. FleetDM is another open source toolkit. It manages Osquery. So Osquery is talking back to FleetDM. So what's going to happen is we can see, make this a little bigger here. You can see I have my host right here. That's my Windows 10 system. It's online. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to say query. I'm going to create a custom query. And we have a little SQL query input box right here and tables, kind of some documentation over here on the right-hand side. So I'm going to say select star from users. If you're not familiar with SQL syntax, we have select and from our SQL keywords. That just says, hey, get all the columns, so asterisk, get all the columns from the users table, and then semicolon closes that query. We can see the columns that are available over here on the right-hand side. So I'm going to run that query. I'm going to run it against the Windows 10 system. It should take less than 10 seconds to respond. It's the longest 10 seconds ever. There we go. All right, so we have a response. We have 9 results here, okay? So if I scroll over to the right-hand side, we have a group IDs, shells, user IDs, excuse me, usernames like sysadmin, Haxer. That's that's interesting. We should probably check that out, right? That's on a Windows 10 system. All right, so we can query our endpoints as if they are a database. And if you look at osquery.io/schema, we can see all the different tables that are available. Right now, I just have, let's do just Windows. You can see 104 tables are available for Windows. So all the certificates on the system, drivers, DNS cache. So lots of really interesting data that you can pull from different systems. And again, this is all free and open source. I've used Osquery in production for a number of years. It's a very powerful tool for security. It can also do process auditing. All right, so let's run that query. Let's come back here. Now, if I show you, let's pull up the processes table. And I do not know how to spell today. There we go. Shows me it's compatible with all the major operating systems and has a lot of columns. So I'm going to say probably select the name and the path so that we don't get overwhelmed with data. So select name, path from the processes table. All right, y'all, you got to help me here. So CESSES. There we go. Okay. And we're going to run that against my Windows system. So it's going to go out and it's going to query all the active processes on the system. And again, this is the data source that, according to the research done, is really the most useful in building detections across the minor attack framework, and that's accordingly more in general. And we see that we have how many results turned? 127 results. That's stuff that you would expect. OneDrive, searchapp.exe, right? Pretty normal stuff. So again, this is no filtering. So wouldn't it be really useful to apply some type of filtering, because I don't want to get all this well-known normal stuff back every time I query for processes on my Windows systems. So I could do that by doing select name path from processes, and I could do some sort of a filter where the name is equal to something, right? What's the problem though? What am I missing here right now at this very moment? What am I missing that Sysmon has? Yes. Yeah, thank you. Who said that? Thank you. You're missing that pre-built list. Like, I have no idea. I mean, yes, I've been doing security a few years, but I have no idea what I should type in there. But the good news is we have a community-driven resource that's already out there that's been used in production for many years across many different environments, but it's sitting in an XML file built for Sysmon. If I go back to that, right here. So I have all of these right here, and that would be pretty cool if I could like convert all of these filters over into a query for Osquery. And that was kind of the thought process a while back that I had, and a friend of mine, Seth, kind of spurred me on to actually try to do something about it. And so I went ahead and figured out a way to build this query. We're not going to get into the query. Basically uses a SQL a SQL thing called CTEs, or common table expressions. So we're defining all of our queries, or excuse me, all of our patterns up here. And then we have like an iterative process where we're removing exact match pass first, and then kind of going from there. Fritz, he's a gentleman who works on Osquery, helped me put together this query. This definitely is not just me. So props to him as well, helping me work through this. All right, so we got this great query. So let's copy and paste this into Osquery. and run that. What am I doing on time? Okay. Give it about 10 seconds, and we should see results back from the processes table. Now, how many results did we have to begin with? Anybody remember? Yeah, 127, I think it was. So 107 results. So again, your mileage is going to vary, but you can see we reduced it anywhere of roughly 20%. Okay, and that's just from that run. We can tweak, and that's just the default stock Sysmon configuration. Is that making sense so far? Okay, so we've already got this community resource. Let's use it, right? The problem is how do you maintain this? This is just like, there's nobody wants to go in here, and you don't want the poor intern coming in here and, hey, I need you to update, line whatever on here, and make sure no, you don't want anybody having to manually update that and maintain it. So that's where I went back and said, okay, there's got to be a way to do this. And so a couple weeks ago, I put together a little utility that will take a Sysmon configuration file and as input and spit out and basically iterate through it, convert it, and spit this out. And so let me show you that real quick. So we're just going to do, if I remember what I named it, so Osquery filters. I'm going to input a config file. Let me make that bigger because I don't think you all can see that. Is that better? Kind of. So Osquery dash filters dash config, and I'm going to input the Sysmon XML file that we just had. And it went out, and this is all the filters it converted. And then it kind of gives us a nice summary here at the end down here. So it converted these specific filters. Images is command line. Command line starts with parent process. Then the full query has been written to fullquery.sql. So if I cat that, fullquery.sql, we can see that's a full query, and I can copy and paste that into here, and we'll be good. Okay, and kind of the idea here is Sysmon configuration files are not static, right? They're updated on a regular basis. I did forget to mention in my PowerPoint that there are 3 main ones out there: Swift on Securities, which I mentioned, Florian Roth, who forked Swift on Securities and keeps it. It kind of takes another, does it from another perspective, and then Olaf's it takes a more modular approach. And the tool that I have is only going to work with the top 2. Olaf has a bit more conditional conditions in there, so it doesn't work with it at this point. But the idea is that you would, if you've already got Sysmon in your environment, or you've or you've played around with it, you can take the filters and the config that you built for your environment and use it as a drop-in replacement with Osquery and generate those filters and kind of bring that into Osquery. So that is available now. I went ahead and dropped it on GitHub this morning. It's more of a proof of concept. It could certainly be used. I didn't see any major errors, but your mileage will vary if you look at it. Any questions so far? Because I'm going to summarize this in just a second. Any questions so far? Yes, sir.
So one of the challenges I see with Sysmon is scale. Like, so does this help with scale as far as automation of those things? Let's say instead of 1 computer, 10,000.
So scale from what perspective? The question was, Sysmon, it's hard to scale. Are you saying from the data generated?
Does this help with scaling, like as far as querying it and doing it or using that method? Like,
Yes.
okay,
Yeah. So at the end of the day, you're going to deal with scale no matter what you install, right? If you've got Sysmon or you've got Osquery, so you have to somehow get the agent installed on the endpoint. You got to keep it maintained, and you've got to be able to update kind of the filter, for it. And this helps more from the perspective of being able to centrally manage a configuration that can be used for something like Osquery. And it's really more because I've used Osquery and Sysmon together in environments, and I would much rather just use a single application like Osquery. So from that perspective, it's better because then I can use Osquery instead of having to maintain both Sysmon and Osquery. Good question. All right, so my takeaways is process auditing for the win, right? We want to do process auditing at some point, but what happens invariably when we turn it on, we get a ton of data generated. So it's process auditing plus filtering for the win. And something like we have, the Sysmon filters and what's available there. But what happens if I'm not using Sysmon, or I want to try something like Velociraptor? Anybody here use or try Velociraptor? So Rapid7 folks out there, Rapid7 just purchased Velociraptor in the last year. It's still open source. They say it's going to be maintained open source at this point. I did the same kind of concept with Velociraptor last year, where developed a tool that will convert the Sysmon filters into Velociraptor. And my thought process is, it doesn't matter what endpoint tool you're using. Let's use the community-driven filters that have already been generated out on Sysmon and bring those into the toolkit that we're using in our environment. And that's really where, again, let's use process auditing plus filtering plus reuse those Sysmon filters. And I have my very low down there. I should have put it up higher. It's been so long since I've talked in person. It's been like 2 years because of COVID. So I'm a little rusty. I forgot to put it up higher. So down here, I have my at Defensive Death is my Twitter, and you also have the GitHub account for this project down there. Again, I want to acknowledge Seth Hanford and Fritz just for their input and their expertise as I kind of worked through this project the past year. Any questions, comments, snide remarks? Snide remarks you can keep for Paul. That's totally fine. Has anybody, so, Paul talked about education and learning. Turning on, installing Sysmon and looking through the logs it generates is a really great way to just learn on your own, see what kind of data is generated. Again, with Security Onion, I'll install Sysmon on a virtual machine, run some malware in a air-gapped environment, see what logs it generates, build detections off of it. It's not anything extremely sophisticated. It's just simply free and open tools that I can use to be able to build those detections. So I really am very passionate about Sysmon, Osquery, Velociraptor, Security Onion. I feel like the free and open source community is the place to be when it comes to security. And I'm glad I could share time this morning with you to evangelize you about it. That's all I have. Thank you all very much. I'm also around. They already cut me off. I am also around if you want to talk about any of this or Security Onion, would love to chat, or about, I play Dungeons and Dragons, Critical Role, and I like ancient Roman history. So if you want to talk about any of that, I'll be around.